Let's talk about the Nunes memo. You've called for it to be released. As you know, the Assistant Attorney General, Stephen Boyd, who's a Trump appointee, he says it would be, quote, extraordinarily reckless for the memo to be made public without a full and thorough review by the Justice Department. Is he wrong?
I believe he is. Mr. Boyd hasn't read the memo, and there are very good reasons why you wouldn't want the FBI and the Justice Department to be the very next folks to review this information. I think that the best thing to do for the country is to release this information into the public square, and then let's have a thoughtful and thorough debate about the type of country we want to have, the type of surveillance policies that we think are appropriate, the type of corroborating evidence that should accompany FISA warrants. And I think that at the end of the day, we might actually get some bipartisan agreement out of this if we can think of it not just in terms of the existing political structure, but whether or not we ever want to have political parties working in concert with our intelligence community to go after other political parties or political candidates. I think we can all agree that we could do better in that respect, and the release of this memo will be a good next step.
Well, you say that there's a good reason to not let the FBI and the Justice Department see the memo before releasing it. What is that good reason?
Well, Jake, I can't go into the reasons that would confirm or deny the facts that are in the memo. I will say that it does not include sources or methods. Typically, we try to be very, very cautious before releasing anything that could disclose a source or a method of collection of information. I think that the Intelligence Committee staff that drafted this memo was very careful to ensure that it didn't include those types of things that would be redacted. Based on what I've read, there are no redactions necessary. We should release this full memo, and we should also be working to release accompanying information and data that buttress the facts that are laid out. And I think that's the only reason why the memo wasn't released sooner. Chairman Nunes and the Intelligence Committee correctly wanted to vet that information and ensure that we've got the most credible product for the American people to review.
I guess one of the things that people who are hearing about the Nunes memo have an issue is if the problem is that, in your view and the view of other House Republicans, the FBI has a bias problem at the leadership level, why would it be that releasing a memo that is supported only by Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee and is being attacked by Democrats as misleading and cherry-picked and highly partisan, why would that be the solution? Are you not trying to solve a problem of alleged bias with a solution that is inherently biased?
No, I think that the best way to sort of sand off the rough edges of this discourse is to have free and open debate with as many facts before the American people as possible. If members of Congress just sit behind closed doors and snipe at each other regarding what constitutes a fact or a cherry-picked fact or inappropriate or appropriate context, we don't really move the debate forward for the country. So if Democrats have ideas or data or information that they would like to have into the public square, so long as it doesn't threaten our national security or disclose sources and methods, I would invite their contribution to that discussion. I don't think it's helpful, though, for them to block the American people from being able to review this information. And you know what, Jake? When you read the memo, it's going to be pretty clear why Democrats, and particularly the Democratic Party, did not want it to come into the public light. And I hope we can move past just viewing these things as Republican or Democrat claims, but evaluate the facts in their entirety and then craft reforms that would apply to both parties equally.
You have said that Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who of course is a Republican, should be fired because he's hired some top investigators who are Democrats. By that same logic, could it not be said that Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who's a clear Republican, has given money to Republicans, or FBI Director Christopher Wray, who's a Republican and has only given money to Republicans, they support the president? Is their fairness at question because they're Republicans as opposed to these Democrats that you're questioning?
Well, Jake, I would take some exception with your premise. It's not my belief that Robert Mueller should be fired simply because people on his team have viewpoints or even that people have just made political contributions. My concern is that the bias that any person can bring to any job actually seemed to manifest in this case in a conspiracy to undermine the President of the United States.
How?
Well, you have Pete Strzok and Lisa Page talking about an insurance policy, talking about meeting in Andy's office
and Strzok was
to discuss
removed.
those things.
Right.
But before that removal, he was interviewing Mike Flynn. He was engaged in other investigative activity. And you have people currently involved in the Mueller probe that defended the Clinton Foundation. With all the talented prosecutors we have in our federal system, why you would go and include people who previously represented an entity that has such a close tie to one of the participants in the 2016 election is beyond me. So I think think that there's really a mosaic of evidence here, not one particular donation or one particular party affiliation that illuminates tremendous bias that should stop this probe from going forward.
One of the other issues at play here is that a lot of the critics of Robert Mueller have been engaged in what seems to be speculative and in some cases even conspiracy theories about what's going on. For instance, last week there were these text messages between Strzok and Page. You just referenced them. They were released. There was a reference to a secret society. You, Senator Ron Johnson, seized on that, suggesting this was evidence of a conspiracy against the president, that the FBI and DOJ. You and others also suggested that these missing texts at the time were also part of the conspiracy. Now, we've since learned that the reference to the secret society seems to have been made in jest when you look at the whole context. And the Department of Justice Inspector General recovered those missing texts. Do you think it's a mistake to push things like this as evidence of a cabal to undermine the president?
Well, Jake, I would say that I was one of the first members of Congress to say that I was skeptical that texts were in fact missing. I was citing back to a letter from December 13th that Inspector General Horowitz sent to Ron Johnson saying that he was in possession of the text messages. And so I never held out the view that it was certain that all of the messages were gone. I believe there was a distinct possibility they were recoverable. As for the secret society comment, I don't believe that there's any group of people with costumes and rituals meeting off campus, but is there a possibility that people were injecting their political viewpoint in a way that manifested in investigative activity or prosecutorial decisions that links back to bias? I absolutely think that was the case. And when you've got people,
didn't you call it the greatest coincidence since the Immaculate Conception?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably not the best analogy I could have drawn, Jake. But I do think that it was an unfortunate coincidence, particularly when you look at the months that were covered. So look, we still haven't seen all those text messages, right? I think we're going to learn a lot when we look at the text messages from the month of May. That was when a lot of these decisions were being made, where if there was a conspiracy, we would have seen evidence in the month of May. And I think we've seen evidence in the text messages that have been released thus far of people getting together and manifesting their bias in the form of a false investigation of the president built on a rotten premise and incorrect information.
I guess one of the big questions for a lot of people who are watching this all is that days before the presidential election in 2016, the FBI director came forward, he made an announcement that Hillary Clinton blames for her loss in the presidential election. He said he was re-examining evidence in the investigation into her email server. If you look at polls, it does seem to have had an effect. And you're saying that the same FBI that did that is biased against Donald Trump, and it almost doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, it absolutely makes sense, Jake. If you take as a premise that there were people at the FBI who fundamentally believed that Hillary Clinton was going to be president and they didn't want to make her mad, you could evidence that claim not by what Republicans have said, but what Peter Strzok and Lisa Page said to each other in their own messages to each other. They said Hillary was going to be president.
I'm talking about what Comey did 10 days before the election.
Right. And so if there were people at the FBI, let's assume Mr. Comey was one of them, who believed that Hillary Clinton was going to be president, you wouldn't want evidence to be sat on or not disclosed that might be exculpatory in an investigation. And so I think that was largely a CYA event with Mr. Comey injecting himself there at the very end.
Wait a second. You're actually citing Comey coming out 10 days before the election saying he was reopening and re-examining evidence in the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton. You're saying he did that to help her?
No. I'm not saying he did that to help her. I think he did it to help himself. I think he did it to have a narrative in the event that these messages or emails that were on Anthony Weiner's computer, if they were exculpatory in the investigation into Hillary Clinton, James Comey didn't want that to be something that was dormant right before an election. And so he released it into the public square.
Do you have any issue with him doing that 10 days before the election? Do you think that injected politics into the FBI?
I think that there's a lot that went on with Mr. Comey and the decisions he made leading up to the election that deserves a tremendous amount of scrutiny. I think it's one of the reasons that the president fired him. And you know what, Jake? When we release this memo, we can have a far more thoughtful and I think hopefully productive discussion about how an FBI director should act in an event like this going forward, because this was an event where Mr. Comey just went rogue and did what he wanted to do without really a linkage to the policies and procedures that should be followed in a serious investigation.